All right, all welcome to a Tuesday afternoon. Today's the 12th, and welcome to Navigating the New TEKS webinar series. I'm in a different location today, and so my camera is not on my screen but on my laptop. So if I'm looking up a little bit, that's because I have to be able to see the screen at the same time. I've also enabled your mics and cameras, so if you want to turn on your mic or camera to ask me a question during any time during this webinar, feel free. It's a not a huge group, so if you just have something you want to ask, you can just unmute and ask away. No problem on that. And then, like I said, I also have got cameras enabled too, if you would like to be able to use those as well. So let me get started here. I'm letting one last person in here. Let's go ahead and get started. So as we've done for the structure of the webinars before, what I want to do is spend about 15 minutes here talking about tonight's topic, and then I was going to give you some time for questions and then give 5 minutes for wrap-ups. Once again, you can drop questions in the chat as they come up, or you can just unmute your mic and ask away that way as well. Don't forget that you've got CEU credits available. So if you attend all 6 webinars, you can earn 3 continuing education unit credits. You can sign up for these webinars at that website there. We have 2 left tonight, is evaluating instructional materials, and then on Thursdays, unlocking the power of ADI instructional materials to kind of help you with all of the things that we've been talking about in navigating the new TEKS here. And I'll also drop that link into the chat here so you all have it. Oh, Jill is not able to join us today, so I'm kind of watching pretty much everything here, the chat features and everything like that. So if we don't respond to you immediately, that is why. So there's that message for you. So let's go ahead and get started here. So what we're going to talk about today is evaluating instructional materials. And once again, my name is Dr. Vic Sampson. I'm the Associated Professor of STEM Education at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I spent a lot of time teaching pre-service teachers, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. I also spent a lot of time looking at research about how the best way to support learners. So that's a little bit about my background here. So let's get started on evaluating materials. I think it's an interesting time to be in the state of Texas right now, just because we've had an opportunity to have new TEKS developed and rolled out, and that go into effect this following year. And often when we think about these kinds of events happening, which don't happen very often, I like it because it's an opportunity to make a change in your district, right? And especially when it's accompanied with an instructional materials proclamation, you actually have resources and funding that you need to make that change happen, instead of kind of running around trying to find ways to fund these different kinds of things happening. So if you're going to be looking at these new TEKS, and one of the big things this year is thinking about what kind of instructional materials we're going to be using to help kids master these learning objectives, is this major question is, what kind of learning experiences do you want the students in your district to have in science? I think that's the fundamental question that you've got to ask yourself when you're thinking about evaluating any kinds of instructional materials. What do you want those experiences to look like? What do you want kids to remember from their experiences, starting in kindergarten all the way through high school? And then the next question is, once you've got a vision of that, like really what you want those learning experiences to look like, the next question becomes, well, what criteria should we use to determine if the instructional materials will make it possible to provide those experiences, right? Excuse me. One of the things that you will see with materials is they're often developed in different ways for different purposes, right? So you've got to start thinking about, do these materials align with the kinds of experiences I want kids to have, and what criteria should I use to be judging that? So one option that TEA makes available is to use the Texas Resource Review. So here on the screen is a basic screenshot of what the criteria they end up using to evaluate instructional materials. And so if you look here in the middle, they kind of break them into 2 big categories, which is content and instructional approach, and then educational supports. Okay, so within each of those two big categories, they've got sections, 9 different sections that range from instructional anchor to evidence-based reasoning and communicating for content and instructional approach, and then progress monitoring and design features for educator supports. Now, as you move over to the right, then you start thinking more about, okay, what were the indicators of meeting this section or meeting this criteria would be? And you can see there's various numbers within each of those sections. So like for instructional anchor, you've got 2 indicators, but progress monitoring, you've got 3, support for all learners are 4. And then what they do is then they assign points by that category or that criteria on there that they're using. So for example, instructional anchor has 8 points available to be scored toward that based on 2 indicators. Knowledge coherence has 12 points based on 2 indicators. So there's a little variation in terms of how many points are weighted to each of these indicators, for example. And then another example is productive struggle is 4 points for only 1 indicator. So you guys have to start thinking about that. So what I want to do is look through some of these indicators real quick to kind of draw your attention on to what kinds of things that this kind of rubric or this kind of evaluation tool privileges, right? So here's one example. This is knowledge coherence. And for knowledge coherence, there's 2 indicators here, 3.1, 3.2. One of them is for materials are designed to build knowledge systematically, coherently, and accurately. And the other one is materials provide educative components to students to support teachers' content and knowledge coherence. Okay. Then they add guidelines to each of these. And so if you look at this first indicator here, the guidance of looking for is I like to try to break these down of what they're actually asking for. So this one is materials vertically aligned and designed to students to build and connect their knowledge and skills. So this basically says, does it follow the alignment of the TEKS, and is there lots of opportunities for reviews? Okay. Next one is are intentionally sequenced to scaffold learning that allows for increased or deeper understanding. So this is basically presenting information from concrete to abstract. The next one is clearly accurately present grade level core concepts. So content in the pictures and text is correct. And then mastery requirements and materials are only with the boundaries. So only assess students on what is in the TEKS for that grade level, right? So you can kind of think of those are the guidance they're looking for that indicator. Then for the next one, this one switches from the learning experience, even though it talks about knowledge coherence and instructional approach, to what information is being provided to teachers, right? So they provide educative components to support teachers' content knowledge. And so when you start looking at the guidance there, basically all of these must have really good and detailed teacher notes to be able to kind of support teachers in using the materials. Okay, so the question becomes, if you look at that, do these criteria make it possible for you to decide if the instructional materials will create the learning experience that you want your students to have in science, right? So when you're looking at those, would that help you determine what kids will be doing and what kinds of things that is going to be going on in their classroom, right? The other thing you've got to think about is how these end up being scored, right? So in anything, there is interpretation when there is point values assigned to different kinds of indicators or criteria, right? So in this case, for knowledge coherence, we end up with having materials can only score a 12, a 9, a 6, or a 3 because each indicator is only given a 0, 3, or a 6. Right? So you can either get 100%, 75%, 50%, or 25% on this indicator. So if you someone ends up with, like, say, a 9 on this, a 9 out of 12, 75%, what does that tell you about the learning experience? What is the piece that seems to be missing, or why did it receive the score on that? So something to think about as you're looking at these materials. Let me look at one more example here for you. Let's look at productive struggle. So productive struggle has only one indicator, and that has materials provide opportunities for students to engage in productive struggle, okay, through reading, writing, thinking, and acting, right? If we start going through the guidance, then we can start kind of decoding what is valued in this. So first one is basically students should be reading, writing, thinking, and acting in science and engineers a lot. But they should only be reading about things found in the TEKS for that grade level. Students should be writing and creating graphs, community understanding of concepts, not necessarily phenomenon, but of the concepts that they're learning. And then students should see phenomena, but focus on concepts, engage in productive struggle, but only about the concepts, including those TEKS, right? So there's like a lot of boxing in of what's happening in terms of the guidance of the indicators you're looking for. Now, once again, that asks the question, does this criterion make it possible for you to decide if the instructional materials will create those learning experiences that you want students to have, right? So I think that's, I'll keep coming back to that over and again. What do you want kids to be doing inside the classroom when you're looking at these materials? Once again, this gives you a total of 4 points. You can only score a 4 100% or a 50% on this, or a 0. But so then what does a score of 2 tell you? So if you get a 2 on this as 50% of being productive struggle, does that tell you enough about why that is? Does it have to do something with the reading? Is it having something with the writing? Is there opportunities to make sense of concepts or no? Is there enough opportunities to engage in certain things? It's really hard to kind of tell that information from that. Okay. So things to consider when you're using something like that, if you decide to go with, or your district decides to go with the TRR, is you guys think about the number of indicators for each criterion, and the different weighting for different indicators can skew results and make it a little difficult to interpret scores, right? So always think about that, is how much are they being valued and what are the indicators actually saying in each of those columns. The other thing to start thinking about too is that when you look at these this rubric, the criteria that are being used to evaluate science materials are pretty heavily aligned with what's valued in math and English language arts for reading, right? Not necessarily what's been valued in science or the research literature on science, right? So it's kind of becomes a general kind of rubric that's strongly influenced by other disciplines, which is fine. It's just something that you've got to be aware of when you're thinking about using the TRR for evaluating materials. Now, there's some other ways you can go about doing this as well. So one of the things that you can do is you can turn to the literature in science education about what's the biggest things that we now know about how we should be teaching to help kids learn the most. And recently this, hold on, let me paste the link in here for you. This report, which I just pasted the link in for you, is from the National Academies of Science, and they brought a group together to kind of look at what is the best literature about how do we help kids learn, what should we be doing inside classrooms. And based on their work in this book, they came up with several recommendations and conclusions, right? So they looked at the literature, what seems to be working. Then they came up with these recommendations about what's going on. So what I did is I ended up taking these recommendations and then I turned those into a different rubric. So they really talk about kind of 2 indicators in their report in terms of recommendations of helping kids learn. The first one is looking at supporting children's learning, engagement, and proficiency. And then the next one is thinking about the nature of the curriculum and how content's integrated. So I'm going to pull this link here. I'm going to share a Google Drive folder with you that has this document in it, so you can look this over and use it as you see fit. So I just added that there. You should be able to make a copy of that folder and keep it on your drive. But you can kind of start thinking about how you might also use indicators like this, right? So does the instructional materials include interesting phenomena and problems? Are the problems, do they designed to leverage students' natural curiosity, right? So you can start thinking about those different kinds of pieces when you're reviewing instructional materials as well. If you're thinking about grades K through 5, oops. Sorry, that was for K through 5. Then there is science and engineering for grades 3 through 6. This is another report that just came out recently, a little bit before the last one. This is focusing on the older grades. I'm going to share a link so you can read this report. It's a fantastic read about the best information that we have about helping kids learn science and engineering grades 6 through 12, so it's discipline specific. Once again, what I did is I took that summary and looked at all their conclusions that they came up with about what helps kids learn and the recommendations for instruction. and then turn that into another rubric that you can use if you're interested in this. So this one really focuses on the natures of lessons and assessments based on these kinds of the criteria that they outline as recommendations. That's in the same folder I just shared with you. You got a copy of that. You can use that one to evaluate materials as well. And then finally, I always like to share lots of information. So while I'm teaching methods courses, either at the graduate or undergraduate level, or helping my students really evaluate instructional materials, I put together a rubric that I like to use, so I thought I would share that with you as well. So this one is in that folder, and I think about using this for K through 12 because I teach all the way from the young ones for the elementary level all the way up to high school, and then the college level as well. So thinking about how we can use this not just on the reports from the research literature, but how can we use this to align with kind of the priorities that are going on in the state of Texas right now. So we look at the three-dimensional nature of the revised TEKS, hugely important to think about that. Another indicator is the instructional materials create meaningful and rigorous learning experiences for students. So these are kind of look-fors, the criteria that you can use for that. Also included some things on assessment and then teacher support as well. So these are all pieces that you can kind of use as tools when you're evaluating different kinds of instructional materials. So as we're wrapping up here, as big takeaways, I think, of looking at evaluating instructional materials, your first one is really be clear about what you want learning experience in science to look like before you start reviewing materials. I would highly recommend that getting together with a team of the people that are going to be responsible for doing adoptions in your district and really talk about what do you want these experiences in science for kids to have, right? Remember, kids have one time as through their educational experience, and we can make it so they learn a ton and fall in love with science, or we can make those learning experiences very kind of fact-driven, vocabulary-driven, more kind of a test preparation kind of thing. So we've talked about kind of these shifts with the new TEKS, but it's up to you to really decide what you want those learning experiences in science to look like. The second thing, then, you have to then really think about which rubric you're going to use or which tool. Modify one of the ones I've given you, or use the TRR if that is aligned with your vision. But remember, different rubrics will lead to different results. You can have the exact same instructional materials, but if you use different rubrics, you're going to come up with some things scoring higher or lower based on what criteria are being included and being asked to look for in those. And then the last one is just kind of a big takeaway is when you're thinking about those different rubrics, make sure your rubric really focuses on what you think is most important, because when it comes to changes in education, you don't have many opportunities to do that. And when they include funding to make a kind of change by adopting new instructional materials, that's even less common. So take advantage of these times when you're looking over these materials and thinking about what you really want those learning experiences in science for kids to look like. So I'm going to post the recording of this webinar hopefully in the next day or two. You can find that on that same website that we've been using before. Feel free to share a link with anyone that may be interested. So even if they're not interested in the credits, feel free to use those. Other things is, don't forget, our last one in this series is on Thursday, and we're going to be talking about ADI instructional materials specifically. That's it. Thank you so much for joining me today. Don't forget about Thursday. We'll start at 4 o'clock. Go to 4:30 Central, or a little bit before, depending on the number of questions. And feel free to sign up or pass along the sign up address so anyone else can join. And that's it. Have a great afternoon, everybody.